You don't always recognize emotional abuse when it begins, because it doesn't arrive like destruction. It arrives like confusion, like silence that feels heavier than words, like tension you can't explain, but your body understands instantly. And that is the first lie it plants inside you. That something is wrong with you, but listen carefully. What if the problem was never your sensitivity? What if it was the environment your sensitivity was placed inside? You were not imagining the shift in tone. You were not overthinking the sudden coldness. You were not too emotional when your chest tightened for no reason. Your nervous system was reading what your mind refused to accept. Emotional abuse does not always leave visible marks. It rewrites your inner language, slowly, quietly, repeatedly, until you begin to doubt your own emotional reality. One moment you feel understood. The next moment you feel like a burden for needing understanding. One moment you are close. The next moment you are being emotionally punished for asking for clarity. And you start adapting. Not because you are weak, but because your mind is trying to survive emotional unpredictability. So you become careful with your words. You rehearse your emotions before expressing them. You measure your reactions so they don't trigger silence, withdrawal, or tension. And without realizing it, you begin living inside emotional surveillance. This is where emotional abuse becomes invisible, because nothing looks dramatic on the outside. But inside you, something is constantly tightening. Your self-expression shrinks. Your emotional honesty becomes edited. Your inner voice starts negotiating before it speaks. And the most dangerous part? You start calling it love. You start calling it normal. You start believing that peace must be earned through self-silencing. But real peace does not require you to disappear emotionally. Real love does not make you fear your own feelings. So if you are listening to this right now, and something inside you feels heavy, familiar, or uncomfortably accurate, don't rush to escape it, because that discomfort is not your enemy. It is your awareness waking up inside a place where you were trained not to feel. And once awareness returns, the illusion can no longer fully hold you. Not anymore. Emotional abuse does not have one face. It adapts. It changes shape depending on who you are, what you tolerate, what you fear losing, and what you were never taught to protect inside yourself. Sometimes it is loud without raising its voice. Sometimes it is quiet enough that you blame yourself for reacting to it. But make no mistake, it is always doing one thing: rewriting how you see yourself. One of its most common forms is control disguised as care, where your choices are slowly questioned. Your independence is gently corrected. Your instincts are subtly redirected until you stop trusting them, not through force, but through repeated emotional discomfort when you don't comply. Then there is guilt-based attachment, where your boundaries are treated like betrayal, where saying no feels like harming someone else. So you begin to choose emotional comfort for others over truth for yourself. And every time you do it, you abandon a small part of your identity. There is also invalidation that sounds logical, where your feelings are not directly denied, but quietly minimized. You're overthinking. It's not that serious. You always take things the wrong way. And slowly, you stop trusting your emotional reactions. Not because they are wrong, but because they were never reflected back to you as valid. Then comes emotional inconsistency, the unpredictable warmth, the sudden distance, the moments of connection followed by emotional withdrawal. This creates something deep inside you, not love, but anticipation. Your nervous system begins chasing emotional stability wherever there is none. You start scanning every tone, every pause, every shift in energy, trying to predict the emotional weather of someone else's mood. And this keeps you trapped, not physically, but internally. There is also silent punishment, no arguments, no explanations. Just emotional withdrawal that forces you to question yourself. You replay your words. You analyze your behavior. You search for the moment you went wrong, even when nothing clear ever happened. And finally, there is neglect that doesn't look like abandonment, but feels like emotional invisibility. Your presence is acknowledged, but your inner world is not met. Your emotions exist, but they are never fully received. So you learn to shrink them, to simplify them, to present only what feels acceptable. All of these forms share one hidden effect. They disconnect you from your emotional truth. Not all at once, but gradually, until you stop asking, "What am I feeling?" and start asking, "Whom?" At will, keep the peace, and that is how emotional abuse becomes invisible. Not because it is subtle, but because you have been trained to ignore your own internal signals just to maintain emotional survival. And if you are recognizing this now, it is not discomfort, It is clarity beginning to return. This is the part nobody sees. Not because it is hidden, but because it happens inside you, quietly, systematically, until your entire inner world begins to operate differently. Emotional abuse doesn't just hurt your feelings. It reshapes your nervous system. It teaches your body that love is unpredictable, that connection is unstable, that safety is temporary. So your system adapts, and survival begins where peace used to live. You start noticing it in small ways first. The hesitation before speaking, the pause before expressing emotion, the internal scan before you say something honest. You are not thinking anymore. You are predicting reaction, seeing mood, predicting consequence. And over time, this prediction becomes your default state. Your mind stops resting in the present. It starts living in anticipation. This is where anxiety is born, not as a feeling, but as a pattern of vigilance. Your nervous system begins treating emotional unpredictability like danger, even when nothing is happening, even when everything is fine, because your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. You also begin to disconnect from your own emotions, not because you don't feel, but because feeling became risky. So you learn subtle emotional suppression. You soften your truth. You dilute your reactions. You delay your honesty. And slowly, your inner world becomes quieter than your outer behavior. But silence does not mean peace. It means containment. Then comes confusion. You remember moments of warmth, moments of connection, moments where everything felt safe, and your mind holds on to those moments like proof. Proof that things are not that bad. Proof that maybe you are overreacting, but your body is telling a different story. Because it does not respond to memories. It responds to patterns. And the pattern is inconsistency. That unpredictability creates a deep internal split. One part of you tries to stay loyal to connection. The other part tries to protect you from it. So you begin to live in contradiction. You miss the person who hurt you. You question your own memory. You replay conversations searching for meaning that keeps shifting. This is not confusion. This is cognitive fragmentation created by emotional instability. And the longer it continues, the more you begin to lose clarity of self. You start defining yourself through reaction, through how others respond to you, through how much emotional space you are allowed to take, until your identity becomes conditional. Not, who am I? But who am I allowed to be in this moment? And this is the deepest impact. Why? Or stop trusting your internal compass. Not because it stopped working, but because it was never validated in the environment you were in. So your nervous system learns a new rule. Stay alert, stay small, stay adaptable. But survival is not the same as living. And at some point, your system begins to whisper something you can no longer ignore. This is costing you yourself. There comes a point where your confusion starts to collapse. Not because everything suddenly becomes clear, but because you become tired of being unclear. Tired of second-guessing yourself. Tired of rewriting your own memory just to keep emotional peace. And in that exhaustion, something begins to shift inside you. Subtle at first. Almost unnoticeable. You start pausing before you react the way you used to. You start questioning the emotional patterns you once accepted without thought. You start noticing the silence after certain interactions, and instead of blaming yourself, you begin to observe. This is the beginning of awakening, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you cannot fully unsee it. You begin to realize something uncomfortable. It was never just about one argument, or one mood shift, or one misunderstanding. It was the pattern beneath all of it. The repetition, the emotional unpredictability. The way your inner world kept adjusting itself just to maintain external stability. And suddenly, you stop calling it normal. You stop calling it love without questioning it. You stop assuming that emotional discomfort is something you must endure to keep connection alive. But here is where the real tension begins. Because awakening does not feel like freedom at first. It feels like loss. You start losing the version of you that tolerated confusion. You start losing the version of you that stayed quiet to avoid emotional consequences. You start losing the version of you that believed love requires self-abandonment. And that loss can feel like emptiness, like detachment, like emotional withdrawal from something you once depended on. But what is actually happening is recalibration. Your nervous system is learning something it was never allowed to learn. That clarity is safer than attachment. That truth is more stable than emotional unpredictability. That your internal reality matters more than someone else's shifting moods. And as this realization grows, you begin to feel something unfamiliar. Not anger, not revenge, not chaos, but distance. A quiet emotional separation between who you were trained to be and who you are becoming aware of. You stop chasing explanations that never made sense. You stop searching for emotional closure from inconsistency. You stop trying to solve what was never meant to be solved in confusion. And instead, you start returning to yourself. Not fully, not all at once, but in fragments. In awareness. In moments where you choose number. Ought to abandon your perception just to maintain connection. And this is the threshold most people never cross. Because on the other side of awareness, you can no longer pretend. You can no longer shrink your truth without feeling it. You can no longer ignore your internal signals without consequence. So you stand at a crossroads inside yourself. One path leads back to familiarity, back to emotional confusion that feels known. The other path leads forward into clarity that feels unfamiliar but honest. And for the first time, you begin to understand. Awakening is not about leaving someone. It is about no longer leaving yourself. Now listen carefully. The real damage of emotional abuse is not what was done to you. It is what it made you forget about yourself. You forgot your emotional stability. You forgot your clarity. You forgot that peace is supposed to be your natural state. But here is the shift. You are not meant to be mentally occupied by confusion. You are number. Meant to live in emotional chaos just to feel connected. And you are not required to stay in spaces where you constantly have to shrink your truth to maintain someone else's comfort. Your nervous system knows the truth before your mind admits it. That tightness, that exhaustion, that silence after the interaction, that is intelligence. Now the awakening begins here. You stop arguing with your intuition. You stop negotiating with emotional instability. And slowly, you return to yourself, not as who they shaped you to be, but as who you were before you learned to doubt your own reality. And in that return, you don't just heal. You become impossible to emotionally distort again.